So what are we going to talk about on black markets? All right. This one is for my fellow emoluments, same as pretty much any other presentation I do. So welcome to this presentation on black markets. So we're going to talk about primary source materials for this presentation, Annals of America, Volume 14, Black's Law Dictionary, 10th edition, in the Merriam-Webster's Thesaurus. Okay, so those are primary source materials for this presentation. So we're going to start with the time-tested foundations for this presentation, right? You've seen me discuss this before, the interest analysis technique, or from 1964, or conflict of laws, right? This is a method of resolving choice of law questions by reviewing the state's laws, or I'm sorry, a state's laws and the state's interest in enforcing those laws to determine whether that state's laws or those of another state should apply. I've been seeing quite a bit of constituency talking about their state constitution does not mention remonstrance. So there it's okay. It's in the process in Jefferson's manual. So that said, all you need is a copy of Jefferson's. And why are you here, right? Again, that's liberty interest, right? Which is an interest protected by the due process clauses of state and federal constitutions, or a fundamental right. Okay, so what is a fundamental right? So as defined in the Black's Law Dictionary, a right derived from natural or fundamental law. Okay, constitutional law, which is a significant component of liberty, encroachments of which are rigorously tested by courts to ascertain the soundness of purported governmental justifications. So those are your two primary differences, right? Liberty interest as opposed in fundamental right, and as far as the analysis technique. So now, those of us in position of emolument on the clock, right? Whether we're stipend or just subsidized, right? You do this specific job and you're paid pursuant to that job, right? So a bureaucrat is a worker in a government agency. And the example they give here, which I thought was hilarious, and I had to share it with you all. The bureaucrats at the town hall seem to think that we need a building permit to build a tree house. So, you know, again, but because this came from the thesaurus, okay, the synonyms, right, are functionary and public servant. This is specifically why your constituency, right, or those of us in position of emolument, we recognize our duties to discharge whatever that specific performance is, right, that job description, as we do our job every single day. Some are better at it than others. Well, that's the reason for these training sessions. So, in so much as black markets, you know, what is the problem? It's social control through black market manipulation of societal differences, right? If I were to articulate it looking at the war on drugs, for example, specifically, we'll just talk about marijuana. That comes from the law of nature. Nature's God put that here as potential remedy for things that would ail you, right? So if it came from nature, it's there for a reason, right? So who has the problem? This is a collective problem, right? As I said, a societal problem. Why should this problem be solved? Well, as far as I'm concerned, and many of your constituents, the reason is obvious. So, and of course, how will I know this problem has been solved? And that, of course, is, as the letter of the law, the preamble states, right? Domestic tranquility is the target resolution, right? That's the goal. That's the end game. So, what are black markets? Who benefits from them, and why do we have them? So, if we're going to differentiate between them, we have those that comply with the Constitution on the left, and those illegal markets, right? Those things that were arbitrarily made illegal for whatever the reason. Well, again, beneficiary of black markets depends on who's running it, right? Who's actually running it. That, of course, being the fundamental key, who's actually running it. So, in so much as what illegal markets are, if we're going to look at it in so much as like a roadmap, okay, government monopoly markets with little to no reciprocity, all managed by foreign emoluments working from pillars of law, violating Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8 of the Constitution's Foreign Emoluments Clause. If I were going to articulate this, which of course I have, okay, bad example, this is the best way to articulate that. Okay, so this is why most people don't see black markets, because those are extra lanes, like those shipping lanes, right? So if we're looking at the difference between these two models, right, the one on the left, legal markets, look at what's going on in the post office right now. Okay, we're shutting down these illegal black markets, many of them, right? Because the people have spoken, right? They want their constitution, they want their lives back. And that's what's on the left. And anything that falls within this criteria that should not be there, guess what? It's going bye-bye. So you're going to hear a lot of complaining on both sides of the aisle. Oh, they're letting criminals out of jail. Criminals of what? Because somebody said that they're, somebody smoking a joint marijuana as opposed to stopping off and having a beer on the way home from work. Well, both of those things are self-medication. Don't take my word for it. Go talk to any addiction group. Again, I consult many sources when I do this type of work, investigative work. So now that we can clearly clarify, okay, the thing that's going to aid these people with their quote unquote addiction, right, is to know what caused it. Okay, so as far as background information, what is your research? Pretty much, how did you discover the problem? Well, transactions is my specialty. It's one of the things that loss prevention was created to maintain the integrity of in the private sector, right? There's a start of a transaction and an end to a transaction. So how did you get involved? I'm sorry, how did you get information to research this problem and attempt to solve it? Again, watch our many videos and some of the reading and source materials that are going to be covered will help you do that. Most of it is interviews, personal experiences, and of course, internet and books. So in so much as a typical Google search on an example of a black market, I used Prohibition, right? This is going to kind of lead into Annals of America, Volume 14. So I said this is not a new problem. So President Woodrow Wilson, on October 28, 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act, right? The popular name for the National Prohibition Act, right? Over President Woodrow Wilson's veto, the act established the legal definition of intoxication liquors as well as penalties for producing them. Doesn't that sound like a bill of attainder to you? Because that's exactly what it was. So that is legislation that prescribes a punishment. It is what it is. Violates due process of law. So let's look at some of the photographs, right? The video log, right, from that era. Okay. This is, if you're looking at eyes, looking at life through the eyes of history. Okay. Look at these things. Goodbye. Goodbye, boys. We're through. Right. The people and the courts have handed us our ticket. We're on our way. If you want liquors, get them now. So, this is pre-prohibition, right? Prohibition is near at hand. prepare for the worst, stock up now. Well, again, knowing that people were going to want to stock up, liquor was the 1920s version of toilet paper. That's pretty much what happened, right? So here's the headline. Here's the newspaper. The U.S. is voted dry. So this was what, November? I cannot see the exact day. But it was, there it is, January 16, 1919. There it is. So looking at the signs, now let's get into where some of the black markets actually started to originate, right? Look at the signage, right? The picketing, right? This is foreign vessels now carry our tourist trade, all getting American dollars. Prohibition is ruining our merchant marine. Let's see. Go America vessels. Go America. I can't read the rest of that. I think that says vessels are tied to the docks. So, that 4 million American soldiers fought for liberty and were rewarded with prohibition. How come? To Congress. You care for our crippled soldiers? Our morals will care for themselves. So here we go again, right? Your job is to care for the wounded, right? Coming back from the war. Don't worry about our morals. We don't need anybody to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever, right? Is this starting to sound a little familiar to you? That's why I said this is not our first time going through this in history, right? So if you're in position of an emolument, we were handed this by people that had an agenda, right? So there we go. What just happened in front of the Supreme Court when Justice Kavanaugh, right, was sworn in? It was literally chanted on live television. I heard that, and this was what I saw. Again, knowledge of law, knowledge of history. What did they say? We like beer. We like beer. Well, in 1933, it was we want beer. So, and of course, me being me, I have to throw the occasional humor in there. Before coffee became popular, beer was often served for breakfast in the United States. So, and here's Doc Brown going, hey, we have to go back. So here's the headline from the Daily Mirror when Prohibition actually ended, right? So, and in so much as it says what the 36th, it's hard to read. I've actually I was going to do some more date specific stuff, but this is pretty much just for instruction purposes, so you kind of get the idea, right? Prohibition was just another example of, number one, a black market, right? Because people were going to do what they were going to do anyway, whether Congress said it was illegal or whether they didn't. So we don't need anybody testing anybody's faith, as it were. So Prohibition ends at last, right? Farewell to the 18th Amendment. Actually made that an amendment and had it overturned. So there's the celebration on the right. And of course, the inevitable politician sitting there with a bottle in his hand. So, that's why I said this is the type of celebration you can expect once all this stuff is over. It's not the first time. It's not our first tiptoe through the tulips, as it turns out. So now let's look beyond the photo logs of the day and see some of the litigation as well as the political climate from the standpoint of the merchants, right? Because that's those of us who are incorporated, right? That taxpayer Bill of Rights. You've heard me talk about that. So this is directly from the book, right? This is why I repeatedly state what's going on right now is nothing new. And to me, it's painfully obvious. So you can read some of the captions here, okay? And I apologize for not blowing that up to where you'll be able to read it better. Well, maybe we'll do that after this recording is over. I'll just pull that slide and blow it up for you. But as you can see,
Are you trying to read that little portion?
yeah. Can you see it? Because I can't. I don't have my glasses on.
I can blow it up.
Oh no, that's okay. That's all right. Well, I'll do that after we get through this, and I'll just leave it at the end of the recording. So, pretty much the short version, what we have here, right? We have the mass of people assembled at the top. Okay, that's pretty much where we're at. Okay, and we have the standpoint of the merchants right here on the left hand side. Okay, and then of course what a raid looks like, right? When the officers would come in and raid, okay, looking for that contraband, that liquor, right? So we're going to go through here and start with Oswald Garrison's Villard. Preparedness is militarism, all right? I'm going to kind of back up here to 1916 and 15 because this is kind of relative as to why things led up to where they were, right? You've heard people talk about militarization of the police. Okay? So this is why, right? This is nothing new, my fellow emoluments. This is how they've jammed you up more than once in history. Don't fall for it again, right? So already strained relations between Germany and the United States were aggravated during 1916 by repeated U-boat attacks claiming American lives. Not wanting to provoke Germany, President Wilson, nevertheless, wished to protect American shipping in November of 1915. Had proposed expenditures to create a much larger navy. Okay. For the next several months, the proposals were debated throughout the country and in the Congress. So here's the commonality, right? What did Trump just get done doing? He just got done rebuilding the military, right? Are we seeing any correlations here yet? But I'm going to continue. Many objected, pacifists, progressives, and socialists all opposed any increase in military expenditures, and they were joined by pro-German elements who, realizing that the United States could not be brought into the war on Germany's side, right? Couldn't happen. At least hoped to keep America neutral, right? Oswald, publisher of the New York Evening Post, right, wrote the following article expressing his pacifist views for a special issue of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences in July of 1916. So this is a key element, right, of some of the cause of the thing causing being the cause of the effect. Okay. This is exactly what we talk about when we talk about that as a maxim of law. That's one of the reasons it's a maxim of law, because as we know, history repeats itself. So, Lawrence Lowell, this was the management of universities. Now, this is where we're going to start having issues with student loan debt. Okay. So you're going to start receiving a bunch of petitions into the legislative finance committees, right, and the House of Representatives specifically, to discharge this debt. And I'm going to explain why you're going to do it. So, the incursion of business principles into the affairs of higher learning that Thorsten Veblen pointed pointed to in the higher learning in America in 1918 was reflected in the organizational structure of many large universities. Okay. Direction of the universities was normally in the hands of boards of trustees made up of businessmen. Huh, here we go again. Who, because they held the purse strings, were often able to assume control over academic matters in ways that severely mitigated the transitional freedom of the scholar. The weakness inherent in such an arrangement became apparent when the pressure on faculties for political conformity during the war was very great. In his annual report for 1919 and 1920, a portion of which is reprinted in Annals of America, Volume 14 here, President Lawrence of Harvard sought to clarify the proper relation between faculties and governing boards. So that's a key element, right? In so much where we're establishing why this is not our first tiptoe through these tulips. We've done this before. So, for example, the exclusion of the word emolument from academia, okay, was essentially misleading. So you have people paying for student loans and student debt that were not taught what they went to school to learn how to do, right? The education was defective, right? So, um, again, here's another one: the schooling of immigrants. Remember the time period? We're into what? Early 20s.
Say
So
again?
we're into the early 20s, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about schooling of immigrants. What year? This was actually 100 years ago. This year. Let that sink in for a minute, whether you're a fellow emolument or not. This is the same conversation we had 100 years ago this year, right? I mean, seriously, let that sink in, right? So, Americanization and assimilation of immigrants was an issue for public schools in any area where large numbers of immigrants tended to congregate. There were basically two theories of what Americanization meant. It was clear to some that immigrants had to lose all of their ethnic character and values and accept the ideals of Anglo Saxon, middle class America, as well as the traditions handed down from the, I think that's Puritan forefathers. Excuse me. It was clear to others that Americanization was a process in which all ethnic groups made their made their contribution, adopting new values while retaining many of the old, right? That's the more of the melting pot theory. So if you've heard of the melting pot theory, that's probably the best way to articulate that. So I can't say John's last name. So anyway, he was a state supervisor of Americanization for Massachusetts, accepted the second point of view in his training teachers for Americanization, part of which is reprinted in this book. So Annals of America, Volume
Amazing,
14.
huh?
Yeah. So I said, when you think about this, we're having the same problem with literally the same black markets we had 100 years ago. And we call this progress. Moving on. So basically this is pretty much the snapshot of the book, that area, the era of 1920 that was logged in Annals of America, right? I scanned that, so this section specifically to kind of help you guys be able to go through, section 49, section 50, 51, 52, 53, and 54. So, it's actually fairly along in the book. It's not right in the beginning. So, this was John M. McKenna. This was what? Yeah, so this is section 51, John M. McKenna. So we're going to pick up there. Okay. According to the famous rule of reason, how many times have you heard me use reason in law as the perfect equity? It's even in the Mason's manual, right? So again, where did it start? Who knows? But we can find it in Annals of America in 1920, right? So promulgated by Chief Justice Edward White in the course of the government's prosecution of the Standard Oil Company in 1911. Only unreasonable combinations in restraint of trade were illegal, right? Interference in commerce, right? One of those things that could have led to the Hobbs Act. Who knows? So, applying this rule, the Supreme Court decided on March 1, 1920, that the U.S. Steel Corporation, founded in 1901 by J.P. Morgan as the first billion-dollar corporation, was not, despite its size, such an illegal combination. Because now we're getting into monopolies, right? Potential monopolies. Okay. So while the business community hailed the majority decision in the case as a sign of the court's growing enlightenment, progressives tended to see it as reversion to the unholy atmosphere of an earlier day. The selection below included portions of Justice McKenna's opinion for the majority and the justice of and of Justice Day's dissent. So that's why I said this section of the book, section 51, is actually very interesting. You've heard us talk about Annals of America Volume 2 a lot on this show. Mm-hmm. Number 14 is just as important as number 2, because if I were to put where we are with respect to markets and black markets, stipends versus subsidies, right? The subsidized market, building battleships and, roads and bridges, that's the stuff you guys see every day when you think of markets managed that we report right through the stock exchange. Okay. Those taxed corporations. The black markets are not taxed, but oftentimes are subsidized via stipends, which is what we're learning now. So let's look at the crisis of the ages, right? How was it defined then? Well, here we go again. That's why I said this is history, ladies and gentlemen. We didn't write it. We know you didn't write it. None of us were alive then, right? So the fact that we're having to discuss it is probably should be your area of greatest concern. So the anti-immigrant views that increasingly prevailed in the early years of the 20th century were born of the conviction that white Anglo-Saxon were meant to control the destiny as well as the social and political policies of the United States. Such attitudes were strengthened in the post-war years by the Red Scare. Of what, 1919, 1920? The fear of the Japanese power in the Far East and of the overwhelming desire for isolation from world problems. One book that expressed the nativist Americans' dread of all things foreign was, I want to say, Lothrop Stoddard's, I think, was The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy, published in 1920. The final chapter is printed in the book. So here we go again. 1920, 2020. As I said, 100, exactly 100 years to the year. Seriously? And we're thinking that, you know, these people think they invented something new. So another one of my favorite people in history, George Santayana, right? Those who forget the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them. That's his most famous quote, right? So George was brought to America in 1872 at the age of 9. Spent 40 years teaching and writing in this country, and then retired to spend his last years in Europe. Always feeling himself to be, in certain respects, a foreigner, Santayana published a number of observations on life in his adopted country, some of the most searching of which were collected in Character and Opinion in the United States. Part of the 6th chapter of this book, here it is, Materialism and Idealism in American Life, is represented here. So materialism and idealism, that sounds a lot like entitlement to me, but moving on. So we're going to get into 1923 a little bit. I shared this section here, section 69, right? At least the beginning of it as part of a pre-post leading into the show. This is anonymous in 1923, section 69 in Annals of America, volume 14. So what I said, you guys think you invented something new? Really? Let's take a look at this, shall we? Anonymous, listening in. Although the invention of the vacuum tube had made the amplification of weak signals possible as early as 1906, commercial broadcasting did not begin in America until the 1920s. By the end of the ensuing decade, rapid improvements had made broadcasting a thriving industry. Every third house in the country had a radio receiver, and listening in had become a national pastime. That one sounds like the tele-live vision of the day, doesn't it? So the following article, published in January of 1923, described the rise of broadcasting stations not yet connected in national networks, and the tremendous success radio was already enjoying. Again, there's there's one of the ways to, right? Weapons of mass distraction, right? Pay attention to the radio, America. It's a new toy. It's shiny, right? You look over here, and we're going to do other stuff over here, which, of course, we've already, any of you who followed this show, you know that we make fun of a lot of that. So let's get into exactly what all of that meant, right? So it would be commonplace. It would be a commonplace remark to say that when wireless telephoning became practical about the year 1914, no one dreamed that its use would ever be general or popular. Even 2 years ago, now mind you, we're talking about the publication of this book. So even 2 years ago, a few enthusiasts would have dared to assert that they would live to see hundreds of thousands of persons interested in radio telephony. Notice the verbiage there. Radio telephony. So let's see, the rapidity with which the thing has spread has possibly not been equaled in all the centuries of human progress. So, when you're going to go through and you're going to talk about, right, the ways to distract and de-educate the people, dumb the people down. This isn't the first rodeo, ladies and gentlemen. Cable television, hey, streaming services, it's the same stuff, just with a different label on it. It's still radio telephony as you move into this stuff. So, who are these radio fans? Strange to say, they are not mechanics, even though every set requires a certain amount of installation, and most sets are either homemade or home assembled. Among the men folk at an office with which the writer is familiar, one in every three has a radio outfit. Right? This is, again, targeting the men folk. Again, we seeing a pattern here, right? Men folk love to tinker. We love machines. We love that mechanical stuff, right? Gearheads of the gearhead men folk. That's us. So, let's see. There was one section in here that here we go. Second column in that second paragraph there. There are now more than 500 broadcasting stations scattered all over this country. Wow. The amateur listener is unfortunate indeed who cannot hear anyone that he chooses among half a dozen, right? Because remember, we're talking analog. And in those days, the range, frequency modulation, and amplitude modulation, which was actually the first radio, frequency modulation came later. But AM amplitude modulation was actually did travel farther, right? Frequency modulation actually is a shorter wave, and it doesn't travel as far. So, but AM radio was actually it actually had a pretty decent range on it. If you had a high tower, a tall tower, you could pick up. The guys used to joke about it, you could darn near hear China from here, right? So, so let's get into the new order of business, right? So now we're going to look at this from an economic standpoint, right? Again, businessmen.
Remember, that was back in the tube days,
right? Right. That's why I said this is nothing new, right? So. Yep. The economist, Thornstein, his last book, Absentee Ownership and Business Enterprise in Recent Times, published in 1923, was meant to be a summary of his ideas on the evolution of the modern industrial system and its social and political consequences. Huh. That's what I said. If anybody's starting to have an eerie familiarity about what's really going on in the cause of a thing causing, this should be like, oh man, God, we have all been lied to. So anyway, businesses, as Vlin saw it, tended naturally to develop into giant corporations, right? Think of it as the Darwinism, right? Climbing that corporate ladder, right? So, and in the early part of the 20th century, there were signs of a further development, the separation of ownership and management. The 8th chapter of Absentee Ownership is reprinted here. Now, the 8th chapter of the book is actually very interesting because what we're talking about with that Darwinism and the fact that, things are going to inherently grow. We talked about the couple of times the housing bubble of 2008 and the fact that nobody really cared to say, hey, where was the air coming from? Right? Hence the debt notes. -1 times -1 is 1. So this is as we look into this thing moving forward.
Well, that's where the birth certificate and all that stuff was kicking in right there.
There you go. So let's talk about the ethics of competition. All right? You're going to hear us talk about competitive markets. This again was part of my business training. People ask me where I get a lot of my training. Had that conversation today. My training is in business. I'm a business guy. I make no bones about it. I don't have issues with law. I know the law. That's one of the reasons I don't have issues with it. So the 20s was the decade of business, right? You hear the Roaring 20s, right? You guys will probably know it as the Roaring 20s. Never before had the country known such prosperity. Moreover, there had been, according to Dr. Julius Klein, an amazing transformation in the soul of business, right? Which had, he asserted, become a thing of morals, right? That's those 10 principles of group decision making, right?
Right.
Business indeed came close to being a new religion, right? You heard corporations and big companies talk about the culture, of their company, right? They want it to be a pleasant working environment in which the factory was the church, work was worship, and advertising was a kind of theology, right? Hence the commercials, those Super Bowl commercials. One thoughtful critic of this novel faith was Frank H. Knight, a professor at the University of Iowa and later at the University of Chicago. His essay, The Ethics of Competition in 1923, challenged the spirit of rugged individualism that marked the era. Part of the essay appears here. Now, there was in this time frame, there was a mass exodus from the cities, right? You know, the women wanted that rugged man. They wanted a man who could you know, work the land, live off the land, right? When the cities had collapsed, depression had happened, blah, 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 which came in 1933, right? So, um, there was this is the pendulum. It goes back and forth. Every time there's quote unquote a war, or every time there's a need for those of us gearheads to do that stuff that we do, that gearhead mechanic stuff, right? There's a mass influx of us into the cities, right? Looking for that work, right? So nothing new. So this is one of the reasons why I released the ethics policy. Okay. So let's look at the Chicago Tribune, right? Lewis Sullivan from the Chicago Tribune on competition. So let's talk about a little bit about competition, right? Now, whether we're talking about light markets or black markets, competition is competition, right? So let's look at that. The early recognition by such architects as Lewis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright of the possibilities inherent in steel frame construction had made Chicago a leading architectural center as early as the 1890s. 1890s. Apparently, an effort to maintain the city's reputation for innovation in building, the Chicago Tribune announced a competition to select the design for its new skyscraper to be erected on Michigan Avenue. Entries were received from architects the world over. But although professional opinion favored the design of Finnish architect, Eli Saarinen, I think, the Tribune awarded first prize in the competition to a local architect whose entry called for a traditional Gothic tower. So Saarinen's design, nevertheless, was subsequently very influential. So Lewis Sullivan, in an article first published in February 1923 and reprinted here in the book, discussed the significance of the choice. So now we're getting into architecture. We're going to start getting into the introduction of those building codes, right? What was legal, what was illegal, and why? And what was the guise behind making that way? What was the quote unquote methodology of application, right? Oh, well, we have to protect the public, right? From anything that would be injurious or harmful, right? So now we're starting to know it, getting into where did this building code even come from? Hence the example in the beginning of the video. This bureaucrat sitting in the town hall seems to think I need a permit to build a tree house, right? So there's quite a difference between a tree house and a skyscraper. So this time we're going to talk a little bit about competition. Okay. Competition, the struggle for commercial advantage. Okay. Well, if we're going to talk about reciprocity is the fair concession of advantages, right? So the key word here, the operative word that we're looking at fundamentally and principally is advantage. So knowing and understanding what market advantage means, right? This is why I've said, looking at the impact, or I'm sorry, the analysis techniques that I employed, conflicts of laws, blah, blah, blah. I said fundamentally, look, over the course of my career, focused primarily on market advantage, maybe I was doing that wrong. Now you're starting to understand why I exercised that introspection and said, hey, wait a minute, I need to rethink this. So the struggle for commercial advantage, the effort or action of two or more commercial interests to obtain the same business from a third party. So now we've got fair competition, horizontal competition, and perfect competition. So if we're talking about, I don't care if it's a black market or a light market, right? The competition is pretty much the same, right? It's the pricing mechanism, right? And the inventory management, the internal accounting. Okay. When you think about black markets, of course, and I don't know if you heard me say this before, black markets are more of a cost accounting mechanism, right? Than, say, retail accounting in a traditional light market. You don't have a point of sale system in a black market. Typically, you don't. So if you want to market something on a black market, whatever that thing would be, something that would be in units of weights and measures, for example, that you'd pay $1,000 for whatever the unit of measure is, you could literally say, I want to make 100% profit. That would be $2,000 resale. Okay. That would be common observance, right, of of what's called a cost accounting model, right? What did I pay for something versus what I want to get out of it in order to keep my market going? So when you think about different accounting, I'm sorry?
Profit margin?
Right. So you want to maintain your profit margins, okay? It just depends on, are you in a light market? Are you in a black market? What's your accounting theory? Okay. What is your business plan? Right. So your business plan is going to be dictated to you by the law. Everything comes from the law. So now we have primary line competition, secondary line competition, unfair competition, vertical competition. This is interesting. Vertical competition is this is competition between participants at different levels of distribution, such as manufacturer and distributor, also termed secondary line competition. So this is, you start to see that the manufacturer, right, and the distributor, right, find themselves competing with each other. This is why you end up with, in many light markets, you've got your cost, right, which is dictated by how much of something you purchase, right? You have oftentimes referred to as green sheet, blue sheet, yellow sheet, right? Yellow sheet being list price, which would be the maximum end user cost that you would pay at a point of sale. Okay. The blue sheet is the one in the middle, which is usually jobber plus or plus whatever, or list minus whatever. It just depends on what company you're talking about and what their methodology is on how they set their pricing schedules. So competitive civil service examination. Now we're going to start getting into emoluments. right? So this is a test designed to evaluate a person's qualifications for a civil service position, right? That would be for this type of examination may be open to all those seeking civil service employment, or it may be restricted to those civil servants seeking a promotion, right? Some form of continuing education being a requirement. I mean, whatever it might be. So, again, whether you're in a light market or if you're in a black market, okay, typically the light markets pay better, private sector business, right? Those of us incorporated. So, because we can set our pricing plan. Our average profit margin was hovered between 30 to 33%, right? For a steady growth management, right? Black markets, it's all over the board. This is one of the reasons why in black markets, the pricing mechanism is just that. There's no set for anything, because what somebody pays for something, they can sell it for cheaper than somebody else, right? That is not unique to black markets, but it's more common as these big companies became big companies, right? So now we have the monopoly leveraging of the light markets. So you're starting to see where there was nothing left in the private sector, right? So everything has now become illegal. So people are going back to black markets, right? Prohibition, speakeasies, that kind of thing. So, so I said this is now we're going to get into competitive injury. Here we go with the injury. You knew it was coming. So this is a wrongful economic loss caused by a commercial rival, such as the loss of sales due to unfair competition, a disadvantage in a plaintiff's ability to compete with a defendant, caused by the defendant's unfair competition. Most courts require that the plaintiff suffer a competitive injury in order to prevail in a misappropriation action, or to have standing to prosecute a false advertising action under 15 USC, blah, 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 blah. So you see the limitations here? Competitive injury, you've heard me say it's a dog eat dog world and you're wearing milk-bone underwear. Well, here's a good example of that, right? Wait a minute. You mean to tell me I have to suffer an injury, right, before I have a right to a cause of action? It's pretty much what the letter of the law says. And here's why. Because you going in there and saying, well, I want to make hamburgers, but there's a McDonald's down the street and they can make them way faster than me. Well, okay. Maybe you want to refine your business plan. What does that have to do with McDonald's? Right? So now we're going to get into credence should be given to a person skilled in his art. That is, when speaking of matters connected with that art. So some of the fundamental principles, right? Those principles of group decision making, those things that we stand on, right? Let's talk about those things with respect to office and contracts, right? Congress shall make no law impairing the obligation of a contract. So let's look at that. He is worthy of honor or office, who with much labor and industry has made himself familiar with the laws of his country. It's a maxim of law. It is what it is. It's one of the reasons why I made it very easy for the judges and justices to grant standing to this office to handle this problem, right? With respect to transactions. Why? Because always in doubtful cases, when it is to be done by which a bona fide contract may be the safest condition, except when it has been drawn up clearly contrary to the law. So you mean to tell me that any person in their right mind, reason and laws of perfect equity here, would willfully enter into a domestic violence contract and have to go into a domestic relations court? Seriously? Come on. It's time to look at this, re-examine these things. you know, calling all cars. We got a 459 number 5 in progress, right? Pull up some of those old votes, and we need to look at some of that stuff again, ladies and gentlemen. It's just
Right.
it's time, right? So again, like Kirk said, you need any help from us, give us a call. We'll be more than happy to help you out. So agreements made contrary to civil law are not to be construed as valid, right? Any of those pretended acts of legislation, it's going to be easy for us to expunge and just kind of do away with that stuff. So again, as I said, if we're going to have reciprocity in a fair marketplace, right? One of the two most fundamental principles come from this definition. Mutual or bilateral action, right? Means that has to be reciprocal, right? And the mutual concession of advantages or privileges for the purpose of commercial or diplomatic relations. It's that simple. Don't make it more complicated than what it is. So, again, so this pretty much concludes the interest analysis technique, right? The conflicts of laws. As we've gone back through history and looked back at this thing one more time, the effects of black markets on the people, right? And what those things actually do. Okay. So I hope that really helps everybody out a little bit. And as far as what's the workable solution? Well, here's a 3-step process for you. Okay. So equity wishes the plundered, the deceived, and the ruined, above all, to have restitution. There's a good maxim of law from which to proceed. Okay. So what we have to do, step 1, is impeach the case and emolument it was conceived under per the rules of criminal procedure and evidence. Why? Because supreme law of the land, minimum due process, that basic Magna Carta due process, right? So apply as much data as possible to the investigation through orders to show cause and writs of supervisory control. Okay, so you're going to need qualified people, qualified auditors, right? There are those of us who are actually licensed. We entered into this reciprocity agreement. One of that, again, sometimes it's necessary. The job just chooses you for whatever the reason. So, it is what it is. You need help from your fiduciaries. Reach out to us. Seriously, reach out to us. We'll give you anything you need. Resolutions come by way of writs of deceit, right? And discharge of the known theft. This includes reconciliations as applicable. So, as we move forward and we transition to removing these bills of attainder, right? We have to reverse the pump. Well, that is step 1 in the impeachment process, which requires a quorum, right? That requires the legislators. So you tell us how you want us to do it. Here's the prototype. If we're going to look at emoluments, color of law, which is exactly what this litmus test is established, right? Quadrants 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? Quadrants 1 and 2 are above the line. These are the republic, the de jure republic. Okay. 3 pillars of law, right? Each with its own specific job, each branch. The things that are below the line have no standing. That's those foreign emoluments. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, and the proper 13th Amendment, those foreign powers, those foreign pillars of law, which inherently always manage to perform exactly the same way throughout history. So, in so much as testing the prototype, here's some just basic criteria for you. What worked? What did not work? And why? What materials need to be changed and or kept and why? Did the size of your prototype give you enough information to move forward with a final product? Why or why not? And did you have other people test your design and give you feedback? Why or why not? Well, again, from what I'm seeing a lot of feedback from a lot of our constituency, right here on Kirk's Law Corner Media Group. Okay. And this company, eClause LLC. And this is the best way to reach out to either one or both of us, right? And to those of you who are watching from positions of emolument, hope you enjoyed this, because this is designed for you to give you anything you need.